Hey everyone, I'm so glad to see you all. By the way, where are you watching from? I'm from Texas, America. Write in the comments, I look forward to your comments. It's so exciting to know where you're all from. Two young black twins knock on an elderly woman's door, sharing a confession that changes her life forever. The evening was cloaked in darkness, and sheets of rain fell relentlessly, casting an eerie chill across the deserted streets. Only the occasional flicker from a lone street lamp offered any relief from the oppressive gloom that had settled over the small town. Most residents had retreated indoors, seeking warmth and comfort from the cold, rainy night. But two young boys, Malik and Mika, were far from the shelter of home. They trudged through the downpour, drenched to the bone, clutching each other's hands as if their very lives depended on it. Both wore expressions not just of worry but of a pain far beyond their years. Malik and Mika were identical twins, barely 9 years old, yet tonight their faces bore the weight of something unspeakably heavy. Their eyes, wide and hollow, reflected a blend of fear and determination as they looked at the small house at the end of the narrow lane. This was the address their father had whispered in his last moments. The final words that had sent them on this journey, a name they barely knew, etched in their minds amidst confusion and grief. Sorry. The house seemed modest and well-worn, as if it held the memories of generations past. Though the windows were fogged over, dim light seeped through, a faint warmth that contrasted the cold, unforgiving rain outside. After what felt like an eternity, the two boys reached the doorstep, pausing for a moment to catch their breath. Malik tightened his grip on his brother's hand, feeling Mika's silent shiver beside him. They exchanged a silent glance, wordlessly encouraging each other to go through with what they had come to do. For both of them, it felt like an act of desperation, seeking out a stranger who, for reasons unknown, seemed connected to everything they had lost. Summoning his courage, Malik raised his free hand and knocked on the door. The sound echoed against the wooden frame, swallowed almost immediately by the rain's continuous pounding. There was no answer. He knocked again, this time a bit louder, and they waited, holding their breath. After a few moments, the door creaked open slightly, revealing the face of an elderly woman who seemed equally surprised and cautious. Her eyes, clouded with years yet still perceptive, scanned the two boys with an expression of confusion. She wore a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her silver hair tied back, and her face bore a mixture of lines carved by both laughter and sorrow. Yes, her voice was soft yet weary, laced with a tone that implied she had long stopped expecting visitors, let alone strangers. The twins stood still, unsure of how to respond, each word feeling like a mountain to climb. Are you sorry?" Malik finally asked, his voice small but steady. The woman, Naisari, seemed to stiffen at the mention of her name. Her eyes grew sharp, narrowing as she studied them. "Yes. And who might you be? Children. What brings you here on such a night?" The boys exchanged another glance, and Malik swallowed hard, trying to find the words. We came because our dad told us to find you." Nai. Sari's expression shifted from curiosity to something darker, a hint of recognition sparking in her eyes. She looked at them more closely, almost as if seeing something familiar hidden beneath the wet clothes and tired faces of these two young boys. Her heart skipped a beat, though she wasn't sure why. "Your father? Who? What is your father's name?" Mika, who had been silent up until now, spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "His name was Daniel." Nai. Sari felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted. The name hit her like a forgotten melody suddenly remembered, stirring a mix of emotions she thought she had long buried. Daniel, her own son, whom she had not seen in decades, whom she had feared she would never see again. The mere mention of his name was enough to send memories flooding back. Memories of a past she had tried to forget, memories that were as painful as they were cherished. Her breath caught in her throat, and she took a step back, steadying herself against the door frame. "Daniel. My Daniel," she whispered, more to herself than to them, as if saying it aloud would somehow make it less true. Her hands began to tremble, and she looked at the boys with renewed intensity, her gaze searching their faces for traces of the child she once held, the son she had lost. There it was, unmistakable, the same eyes, the same solemn expression, only now framed in the faces of his children. "Come in," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, still reeling from the revelation. "Please, come inside." The boys hesitated, but the warmth of the house beckoned them, promising a brief reprieve from the cold outside. Slowly they stepped across the threshold, bringing with them the faint scent of rain and sorrow. NY. Sari led them into the small living room, where an old, faded couch and a few chairs sat near a tiny fireplace. She motioned for them to sit down, her eyes never leaving them, as if afraid they might disappear if she looked away. The silence that filled the room was thick, each of them weighed down by questions unasked and answers unknown. She studied the boys for a moment longer, noticing the exhaustion etched into their young faces. "You said. Your father told you to find me," she asked cautiously, not sure she was ready to hear the answer. Malik nodded, his face solemn. He died a few weeks ago. Before he left us, he told us that if anything ever happened to him, we should come find you. He didn't say why, just that you'd know the truth. Nye. Sari's face softened, a mixture of grief and guilt tugging at her heart. She had always wondered what had become of Daniel, but she had never expected this, a connection reestablished only through tragedy. Her thoughts raced, struggling to piece together the fragments of the past with the present that now sat before her. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, resting her hand gently on Malik's shoulder, feeling the weight of the past come crashing down upon her. I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "It's been so many years, so many regrets," she trailed off, unsure how to explain a lifetime of choices, sacrifices, and the pain of a mother forced to abandon her own child. The memories she had kept buried began to surface, unbidden and relentless. The boys listened in silence, sensing her pain. Though they were young, they understood loss, understood the hollow ache of grief that had filled their lives since their father's passing. They had come here with questions, hoping for answers, but what they found was a shared sorrow, a bond forged by the losses they had all endured. As Nye. Sari looked at the boys, she knew she could not keep her past hidden from them. She owed them the truth, as painful as it might be. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she began to speak, her voice heavy with the weight of years gone by. "Daniel was my son. I loved him dearly, but circumstances took him from me when he was young. I had hoped that one day we would find each other again, that I could explain everything. But it seems fate had other plans." The words hung in the air, and the boys sat motionless, absorbing the reality of their connection. They hadn't just come seeking a stranger, they had come seeking a family they never knew they had. For the first time since they had arrived, Malik and Mika felt a glimmer of comfort amidst the pain. Despite the darkness of the night, they had found something precious in this small, dimly lit home, a part of their father that still lived on, a bridge to the past that was now part of their present. And for NY. Sari, the arrival of these two boys felt like a reckoning, a moment she had long dreaded yet yearned for, a chance to finally confront the ghosts of her past and perhaps find a way to make amends for the choices she had made so long ago. The warm glow of the living room seemed to soften the rain's relentless pounding on the windows, but the tension hung as thick as the mist outside. Malik and Mika sat close together on the worn couch, their young faces bearing a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and longing. Across from them, NY. Sari sat, lost in thought, as if caught between the present and a distant past she had tried so hard to bury. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked at the boys, her grandchildren. She had only just met them, yet she felt as if she had known them forever. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I imagine you boys have questions, and I owe you answers. I owe you more than I could ever give," she said, her voice cracking. "I never thought I'd see anyone connected to my son, your father Daniel, again." Malik and Mika exchanged a glance before Malik spoke, his voice steady but cautious. "Our dad always said there were things we weren't old enough to understand. But then, everything happened so fast, we just didn't know where else to go." My. Sari leaned forward, her eyes filled with regret. She had never intended to revisit these memories, yet the faces of these two boys, so much like her lost son, forced the truth out of her, bit by bit. "Your father, Daniel. He was my son," she said softly, still adjusting to the reality of what had transpired. "I loved him with all my heart, but life was so different back then, so complicated. I was young, poor, and alone. Keeping him felt impossible." The twins sat in stunned silence, letting her words sink in. For as long as they could remember, their father had always been guarded, careful with his past, and he had mentioned NY. Sari only once. They could tell from his face then that even just saying her name had been hard. Now they understood why. "Why did you leave him?" Mika's voice was small and hesitant, almost afraid of the answer. A heavy sigh escaped her as she closed her eyes. recalling the hardest decision of her life. I was young, much younger than I am now, and I was not ready to raise a child on my own. I wanted to give him a better life, and I thought the only way to do that was to let someone else take care of him. She took a moment, trying to maintain her composure. I found a family, the Evans family. They were kind people, and they promised they would give him everything I couldn't. I believed he would have a better life with them than he would ever have with me. The words hung in the air, each one hitting the twins like a hammer. Malik clenched his fists, his mind racing. Then, "Why did Dad tell us to find you?" he asked, unable to keep the frustration from creeping into his voice. He could have told us everything before he was gone. Nye. Sari's heart ached at the anger in Malik's tone. She knew that her decisions had affected her son and his children in ways she could never have imagined. The guilt, long buried, now rose to the surface, twisting her insides. "I hoped that maybe one day he'd find it in his heart to forgive me," she whispered. But it seems that the years passed, and I never had the courage to reach out. I assumed he'd moved on, that he was living a happy life. I had no idea. I had no idea that he would ever. That you would ever. Mika leaned forward, his expression a mixture of anger and sadness. "He did love us, you know. He loved us so much, but we always felt like he was hiding something, that he was carrying a pain he couldn't share." Nye. Sari nodded, pain filling her eyes. "Your father. He was always so sensitive, even as a child. He felt things deeply, but he never liked to let others see his pain. Perhaps he carried a part of me with him, a part of the hurt I left with him. I wish I could go back and undo all of it." The three sat in silence, Nye. Sari lost in her memories, while Malik and Mika tried to come to terms with this unexpected revelation. Their hearts ached, not just for the loss of their father, but for the woman sitting before them, who had lived so long with this quiet, gnawing sorrow. Did he ever try to find you?" Malik asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Nye." Sari nodded, her gaze falling to her hands, which lay clasped in her lap. "He tried. When he was younger. But by the time he found where I lived, I had already moved on, changed addresses. By then I had convinced myself that I needed to let him live his own life. I thought I was protecting him from more pain, but now I see I was only protecting myself." A chill settled over the room as Ny. Sari's confession deepened. She looked up at the twins, tears glistening in her eyes. "I don't know why he wanted you to find me, but perhaps he hoped that, through you, I might find forgiveness, and that you might understand the choices he made." Malik shook his head, his face a mask of anger and betrayal. "He didn't even tell us the truth about you. We've been alone ever since he was gone, not knowing where we came from. He could have trusted us." Ny. Sari's face crumpled with guilt. "He must have thought he was protecting you from his own pain, the pain I gave him. The burden of secrets is a terrible thing to pass down, and yet, it seems I have done just that to all of you." The twins felt her remorse, the raw agony of a lifetime of regrets. Despite their anger, they sensed the depth of her suffering, a sadness so deep that it had become a part of her being. Nye. Sari had become a prisoner of her own past, and in a way, so had they. After a long silence, Mika finally spoke, his voice softer this time. "So, what do we do now?" Nye. Sari looked at him, her heart aching at his innocent question. "I don't know, Mika. I don't know if there is anything we can do, except try to understand each other, try to make up for the time we've lost." As the rain continued to beat against the window, the twins and their grandmother sat together in the quiet room, united by a sorrow they had all shared, yet isolated by the secrets that had kept them apart. For Malik and Mika, the answers they had sought did not bring the comfort they had hoped for. Instead, they had uncovered a legacy of hurt, of choices made out of love and fear, and the haunting knowledge that some pains were too deep to ever truly heal. And for Nye, Sari, the pain she had carried for decades now felt raw and fresh, renewed by the faces of the boys before her, the last pieces of her son she had left, reminders of a life she had once dared to hope for. The rain continued through the night, hammering against the windows like a relentless reminder of the darkness lingering between the three of them. Malik and Mika slept fitfully in the small guest bedroom, sharing a single bed. Nye. Sari had made up for them with an old quilt she hadn't used in years. Exhaustion had finally claimed them, but even in sleep, their small faces were creased with worry. Nye. Sari sat by the fire, unable to sleep, lost in the memories of a life that had long since faded. Her heart felt torn open, raw with the suddenness of it all, the painful memories, the new faces of her grandchildren, so much like her son. She hadn't anticipated this reunion, hadn't prepared herself for the flood of guilt and regret that now overwhelmed her. She thought about the paths she could have taken, the choices she could have made differently, and the life she might have had if she had kept her son, her Daniel, by her side. As dawn approached, she finally roused herself from her thoughts and went to the kitchen, brewing a pot of tea and waiting for the boys to wake up. She knew that, after everything they had been through, they deserved to know the full story of why their father had grown up without her. She owed them honesty, no matter how painful it was for her to remember. By mid-morning, the rain had turned to a steady drizzle, and the boys emerged, looking slightly disheveled but determined. They joined her at the small, cluttered kitchen table, eyeing her with an expectant, almost guarded expression. "I suppose you both deserve the full story now." Sari began, her voice hoarse from a sleepless night. "It's time I told you everything." The boys looked at each other and nodded. Malik, ever the braver of the two, leaned forward, as if steeling himself for what was to come. "When I was young, I lived in a town not so different from this one, except times were much harder back then, Nai." Sari started, her gaze drifting to the rain outside. "I was alone, barely scraping by. Your grandfather had left us before Daniel was even born. I wanted nothing more than to keep my baby, to love him and protect him, but life had other plans." She paused, gathering herself as she saw the boy's eyes filling with the weight of her words. She had never spoken of this to anyone, not even to herself in the privacy of her thoughts. It was as if her memories, once locked away, now emerged in every excruciating detail. "I was working 3 jobs, barely making enough to survive, let alone provide for a child," she continued. I tried so hard. But each day it became clearer to me that I couldn't give him the life he deserved. I couldn't even promise him a stable home. So, when he was a year old, I made the hardest decision I'd ever have to make." Her voice caught, and she wiped away a tear that had escaped. The boys remained silent, their eyes glued to her face, waiting. She could tell that they didn't understand fully, not yet, but that they were trying to. "I found a family willing to adopt him, the Evans family. They were kind, warm, and stable. They promised they would give him a good life, a life with opportunities I could never provide. I believed them, and I gave him up, hoping that he would grow up happy, even if it meant he grew up without me." The words hung heavy in the air, the silence that followed thick with the ache of old memories and fresh wounds. Mika spoke next, his voice barely above a whisper. "So you never wanted to find him? You never tried?" "Nai." Sari flinched at the question, as if it had struck her physically. She sighed deeply, searching for the right words. "I wanted to, Mika. I thought about him every single day. I kept tabs on him as much as I could from afar, but I was afraid. By the time he was old enough, the Evans family had moved far away. And I told myself he was better off not knowing the truth. I convinced myself he was happier without me. And then one day I learned they had moved again, and I lost track of them entirely. I had no way to find him, no way to know if he even remembered me." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she made no move to wipe it away. "I never imagined he would come looking for me. I didn't think he'd ever. Forgive me." The boys absorbed her words in silence, each lost in thought. Malik finally looked up, his expression hardened, as though he were piecing together a puzzle in his mind. "But he did look for you," Malik said, his voice filled with a quiet strength. "He always wondered who you were. He had questions, and he always told us that someday, when the time was right, we'd know the answers. I think he was trying to protect us, the way he thought you were trying to protect him." Nai. Sari's heart broke at Malik's words. Her son had spent his life searching for answers she had buried, and now, even in his absence, his sons were here, searching for the same truth. Her sacrifice, meant to protect him, had instead left a hole in their family, a legacy of pain she had passed down without meaning to. Mika, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke, his voice trembling. "Do you think he was happy?" Nai. Sari felt her heart constrict. "I don't know, Mika. I hope he was. I hope he found joy and love and everything I couldn't give him. But I know now that he carried pain too, pain I left him with. And I wish I could tell him that I'm sorry. that I loved him, that I never stopped loving him. Silence fell over the table once more. Malik and Mika sat with her words, letting the truth settle in, painful as it was. For so long they had wondered about their father's sadness, the parts of himself he had kept hidden from them, the secrets he had taken to his grave. And now, sitting across from the woman who had once loved him so fiercely, they understood perhaps for the first time that grief was a burden passed down, a weight that shaped their family in ways they were only beginning to grasp. "I understand if you're angry, Noi," Sari whispered, finally looking up at them. "I understand if you hate me for what I did. I can't change the past. But if there's anything I can do to help you now, to be here for you. I'm here. I want to be here." Malik's face softened and he reached out, placing a hand on hers. "We don't hate you, Nenwai. Sorry. It's just a lot to understand. But I think Dad would want us to be here. He would want us to know you." "My." Sari's heart swelled with gratitude and regret. She had spent a lifetime in solitude, her heart locked away. But now here were two young boys willing to forgive, to understand, to bridge the gap she had never been able to cross herself. They had come not just looking for answers, but seeking a connection to their past, to the family they never knew they had. The rain outside had finally stopped, leaving behind a quiet, almost eerie calm. The house felt warmer, filled with a new sense of belonging, however tentative. And as they sat together, Sari felt a glimmer of hope, a possibility that perhaps, through Malik and Mika, she could finally make peace with her past and begin to heal the broken pieces of her family. For the boys, Sari's story was more than a confession. It was an invitation to confront the parts of themselves shaped by a father's hidden grief and a grandmother's silent regret. In that quiet moment, they began the journey of unraveling not just her story, but their own, a journey into a past filled with love, sacrifice, and the hope that somehow they could mend the wounds they had inherited. The rain had cleared by afternoon, leaving the air damp and the earth soaked, as if the land itself had wept alongside Sari and the twins. Malik and Mika, still reeling from the weight of their grandmother's confession, stood by the small, fenced garden outside her home, staring at the patches of wildflowers that had sprouted after the rain. In their short time here, they'd begun to recognize the lingering shadows of pain, the unseen wounds left by decisions made decades ago. The reality of it clung to them, heavy and raw, and it left them feeling hollow. Sari joined them outside, watching them as they took in the quiet, overgrown garden she had tended to for years. She had poured her heart into this place, each flower bed, each hedgerow perhaps as a silent offering, hoping that tending to something fragile might atone for her long-held regret. "Your father used to love this garden," she said softly, her gaze distant. "When he was very small, he would play out here for hours, talking to the flowers as if they could talk back. It was his safe place." Malik and Mika exchanged a glance, their father's quiet presence hovering between them, a ghost they felt more acutely with every memory Sari shared. They remembered him as he had been before he passed, gentle, reserved, but burdened by secrets he could never share. Now in the memories Sari gave them, they could see shades of the boy he had been, pieces of a life he'd had long before they ever knew him. Sari took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she turned to face them. "I can't go back and change what I did," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I want you to know that every day I thought of him, of your father, of the life he might have had if I'd been there for him. And I want to know about him now, through you both, if you're willing to share that part of him with me." The boy's expression softened. Malik, always the more vocal of the two, stepped forward. "Our dad. He was a good man, Sari. He was kind, always willing to help others, even if he was quiet. He worked hard, harder than anyone I know. He used to tell us that working hard was how we could create something better for ourselves, for our family." Mika, nodding, added, "He had this way of making us feel safe, even when we didn't have much. He never talked much about the past, though. I think it hurt him too much." Sari's face fell at this, her heart breaking at the thought of her son bearing the weight of her absence. "I can't imagine what he went through. I should have been there. I should have known he would need someone to lean on." She let out a shaky breath, looking around the garden, as though searching for remnants of the boy he'd been, hidden in the petals of each flower. She wished more than anything that she could hold her son again, reassure him, and tell him the truth she'd been too afraid to share. But he was gone, and all she had now were these two boys who stood before her, carrying his legacy and the echoes of his silent suffering. Did he ever say anything about me?" she asked hesitantly, almost afraid of the answer. Malik and Mika looked at each other, unsure of how to explain. Their father had rarely spoken about his mother, and when he did, it was with a mix of pain and resignation. But there had been moments when he'd look off into the distance, lost in thought, and they'd catch a glimpse of something like yearning. He never said much, Malik admitted, but sometimes he'd mention you. He didn't say much about why you weren't there, only that things had been difficult. I think he understood in his own way, but it hurt him. It hurt him to think about it. Nai. Sari closed her eyes, letting the truth of her son's sorrow wash over her. She had once believed that leaving him had been a kindness, that her absence would allow him to grow up free from her struggles. But now she understood that her absence had left a wound, one that had cut deeper than she'd ever realized. I know I can never take back what I did, she whispered, her voice breaking. But if there's any way I can be here for you now, any way I can help carry the weight of this burden, I want to be here for you. I want to honor him by making up for all the time we lost. The boys looked at her, their expressions a blend of compassion and confusion. They had come searching for answers, but instead, they'd found a broken woman, a grandmother weighed down by years of guilt, just as they were burdened by the legacy of their father's silent pain. Yet they sensed a chance to rebuild, to forge something new from the fragments of the past. NY. Sari's hands trembled as she reached out, taking each boy's hand in her own. I may not have known him as a man, but I loved him as my child. And I see him in both of you, in your strength, your resilience, and your kindness. I know now that he left me these gifts in both of you. For a long moment, they stood in the garden, connected by their shared loss and the fragile hope that, through each other, they might heal the wounds that had haunted their family. In the silence that followed, they felt their bond deepening, a tentative bridge across the pain of their history, built not just on words, but on the understanding that some wounds could only heal when shared. In the depths of that quiet understanding, they each found something they hadn't known. They were searching for a glimpse of forgiveness, a sense of peace, and the beginning of a family once thought lost. The days that followed were a quiet blend of healing and reflection. As Nai, Sari, Malik, and Mika settled into a fragile routine. Each morning they would gather in the small, weathered kitchen, sharing breakfast and stories about the father they all missed. Nai. Sari learned of her son's warmth, his resilience, and the love he had poured into his children, even as he carried the unspoken pain of his past. In turn, she shared tales of her own struggles, of the sacrifices she had made, and the decisions that had haunted her. Malik and Mika absorbed these stories with a mix of sadness and understanding. They had spent their lives piecing together fragments of their father's past, but now with Nai. Sari's presence, they began to see him as a whole person, a man shaped by the choices and hardships of those who came before him. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting the small town in a warm, golden glow, Nai, Sari took the boys to a small clearing at the edge of her garden. She pointed to a lone tree standing tall, its branches reaching toward the sky. Your father planted this tree when he was very small, she said softly. He would call it his wish tree, and every year he would hang a little token on one of its branches, something he thought was special, something he hoped would bring him good fortune. I haven't added to it since he left, but maybe it's time we continue his tradition. The boys looked at the tree, a quiet reverence in their eyes. Malik stepped forward first, a small pendant in his hand, a charm that had once belonged to their father, something he had carried with him through life's trials. Gently, he hung it on one of the branches, the pendant swinging in the soft breeze. Mika followed, placing a small, folded piece of paper he'd written on earlier that day. It was a letter, one he'd written to his father, a way of expressing the words he'd never been able to say. He tied it to a branch, letting the wind carry his unspoken message into the silence. Nai. Sari watched, her heart swelling with a bittersweet pride. She had lost her son, but in these two boys she had found pieces of him that still lived on, a testament to his strength and his spirit. Tears filled her eyes. But this time, they were not of sorrow, they were of gratitude, of love that had been given a second chance. In the fading light, the three of them stood together, hands clasped, bound by the shared pain and healing of their journey. Nai. Sari knew that she could never erase the past, but she could nurture this new beginning, this fragile hope that had blossomed between them. As they turned to walk back to the house, Nai. Sari felt a weight lift from her heart. She knew there would still be difficult days, moments when the shadows of regret would return, but she also knew she would not face them alone. Malik and Mika had given her the gift of forgiveness, and with it the chance to rebuild a family that had once been broken. Together they returned to the warmth of Nai, Sari's home, where the echoes of the past lingered, no longer as reminders of loss, but as seeds of love, resilience, and new beginnings. And as they closed the door behind them, they stepped into the quiet promise of a future that, despite everything, was now filled with hope.